Welcome, survivors, to the edge of the apocalypse, where every story is a fight to stay alive. Thanks from the bottom of my heart for every like, comment, and sub. Keep hitting that bell and join the fight with me. Thanks from the bottom of my heart.
The static was the first thing that broke the professional silence of the tower. It wasn't the usual white noise of a radio check. It was a wet, ragged sound, like someone trying to breathe through a mouthful of gravel. I sat in the dim glow of the radar screens, my coffee gone cold, my fingers hovering over the transmit button. Delta 742, do you copy? I asked, my voice steady despite the prickle of unease crawling up my spine. There was no reply, only that sickening, liquid gurgling. I looked over at Miller, the senior controller on the shift. He was staring at his own monitor, his face drained of color, his jaw hanging slack. Through the massive, wraparound windows of the O'Hare control tower, the world looked deceptively normal, a sea of runway lights stretching out like a grid of diamonds against the Chicago night. But then, the first flash of fire erupted. A baggage tug had swerved into a fueling station near Gate B12. The explosion was a silent bloom of orange through the reinforced glass. I didn't see a driver jump out. I saw a shape, something that used to be a man, dragging itself out of the wreckage while its lower half was still pinned under the crumpled metal. It didn't scream, it just pulled. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird in a cage of bone. Another voice cut through the static, high-pitched and hysterical. "This is United 1-5, we have a breach. The cockpit door is, oh God, they're eating him. They're eating the co-pilot." I didn't have time to process the words before the radar started litany of doom. 6 planes, all on final approach, began to veer off course simultaneously. They were drifting, unguided, heavy with thousands of tons of fuel and thousands of souls. I grabbed the mic, my palms slick with a cold, greasy sweat. "All aircraft, this is O'Hare Tower, execute immediate go-around. Clear the airspace." But the radios were a symphony of slaughter. Screams, the sound of breaking glass, and that same rhythmic, wet tearing sound. I watched, paralyzed, as a Boeing 737 dipped its wing too low. It clipped the top of the terminal, a shower of sparks and debris raining down like a morbid celebration. The plane didn't just crash, it disintegrated, sliding across the tarmac in a trail of burning jet fuel. And then I saw them. In the harsh, flickering light of the fires, the ground crew weren't running to help. They were running to hunt. Hundreds of figures swarmed the wreckage, moving with a jerky, unnatural twitch. They weren't checking for survivors. They were pulling bodies from the twisted metal and leaning down, their heads bobbing in a frantic, hungry rhythm. The metallic taste of adrenaline flooded my mouth, sharp and bitter. Miller stood up, his chair clattering to the floor. "My wife," he whispered. "She's on the red-eye from Denver. She's at the gate." He didn't wait for a response. He bolted for the elevator, his footsteps echoing like gunshots in the sterile room. I wanted to scream at him to stay, to tell him the elevator was a coffin, but the air was thick in my lungs, like I was breathing underwater. I was alone in the tower now, the king of a dying world. Every screen showed a different nightmare. A plane on taxiway Alpha had been boarded by the things. I could see the silhouettes against the cabin windows, a frantic, rhythmic pounding against the glass until it shattered. People were jumping from the emergency slides, only to be tackled by the waiting horde below. The uncanny valley hit me then, the way those things moved. They weren't humans anymore. They were biological machines driven by a single, pulsing directive: consume. Their movements were too fast, their limbs snapping into place with a violence that should have broken bone. I retreated to the corner of the console, my eyes fixed on the heavy, steel door that led to the stairs. The elevator had stopped on the 4th floor. I heard the chime and then a sound that will haunt me until the day I stop breathing. Miller's scream, cut short by a sound like a wet towel being wrung out. The scratching started a minute later. At first it was faint, like a mouse behind a baseboard, but it grew. Soft thuds followed by the rasp of fingernails, or what was left of them, against the steel. They knew I was up here. I could hear them sniffing, a wet, rattling inhalation through the gap at the bottom of the door. Power flickered, the humming of the servers dying down to a low moan. The emergency lights kicked in, casting everything in a nauseating, rhythmic red pulse. I looked out at the runways one last time. Chicago was burning. The skyline was a jagged silhouette against a horizon of fire. There were no more planes in the sky, only the distant, fatting drone of engines as the last few aircraft ran out of fuel and fell silently into the dark. I gripped a heavy metal flashlight, the only weapon I had. My breath came in short, jagged gasps, the cold air of the tower now smelling of smoke and copper. The door groaned, the heavy hinges beginning to warp under the pressure of a dozen bodies pressing from the other side. I wasn't an air traffic controller anymore. I was a survivor, and the nightmare was only beginning. The groan of the steel door was more than just a sound. It was a vibration that traveled through the soles of my shoes up my spine and settled into the marrow of my bones. I stood there, paralyzed for a fraction of a second, watching the heavy metal warp. The top hinge screamed, a high-pitched metallic shriek that cut through the low-frequency rumble of the distant city. The emergency red light washed over the room every 3 seconds, a rhythmic, bloody heartbeat. Pulse, I saw the shadow of a hand, fingers elongated and blackened, slipping through the widening crack. Pulse, the hand was joined by another, the skin shredded against the jagged edge of the door frame. Pulse, I saw a face, or what remained of one, pressed into the gap, a milky eye staring blindly into the room, searching for the source of the heat and the heartbeat it knew was there. I didn't wait for the fourth pulse. I swung the maglite with everything I had. The heavy aluminum casing connected with a sickening crunch, the kind of sound a dry branch makes when it snaps under a heavy boot. The head disappeared back into the darkness of the stairwell, but the pressure on the door didn't let up. They weren't individuals anymore. They were a collective weight, a physical force of nature driven by a singular, mindless hunger. I scrambled backward, my heels catching on the tangle of headset cords and power cables that littered the floor of the control cab. This place, which had been my sanctuary of order and precision for 12 years, had become a glass-walled trap. I looked around, the panic finally starting to boil over. The emergency escape hatch. It was a narrow, vertical chute located behind the supervisor's desk, intended for fires or structural collapses. I'd never seen it open, not even during the drills. I dove for it, my fingers fumbling with the recessed handle. Behind me, the door finally gave way. The sound was like a car crash, a sudden, violent eruption of splintering wood and shearing metal. They poured in, a gray, stumbling mass of tattered uniforms and blood-soaked civilian clothes. I recognized Dave from ground control. He was missing his lower jaw, his tongue lolling uselessly against a throat slick with black ichor. He didn't recognize me. He didn't care that I'd bought him a beer last Friday to celebrate his daughter's graduation. He just lunged. I yanked the hatch open and threw myself into the darkness just as a cold, clawed hand brushed the fabric of my flight jacket. The descent was a blur of friction burns and the metallic taste of adrenaline. I slid down the ladder, my feet barely touching the rungs, the sounds of the tower, the snarling, the wet tearing of the leather chairs, the electronic chirping of abandoned consoles, fatting as I dropped into the belly of the airport. I hit the bottom, landing hard, the impact jarring my teeth. I was in the maintenance sublevel, a labyrinth of pipes, hummable transformers, and salt-stained concrete. The air here was thick and stagnant, smelling of ozone and old dampness. I clicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting a weak, dusty path through the dark. I needed to get to the tarmac. If I could get to one of the ground vehicles, maybe a tug or a follow-me truck, I'd have a chance of breaking through the perimeter fence. The airport was a fortress, but it was a fortress filled with the very people who had been trying to flee it. Every gate, every terminal was a potential kill box. I moved quietly, my breath shallow. The silence here was worse than the noise above. It was heavy, expectant. Every drip of water from a leaky pipe sounded like a footstep. I passed the break room. The door was ajar. Inside, a television was still on, its screen a blizzard of static. But the emergency broadcast system's tone was a constant, piercing whine. It was a digital scream for a world that wasn't listening anymore. I found a utility belt on a workbench, heavy-duty shears, a multi-tool, and a roll of duct tape. I strapped it on, the weight grounding me. I was transitioning, shedding the skin of the man who coordinated landings and takeoffs, and becoming something more primal. I found the service exit that led to the ramp. I cracked it an inch, the cold Chicago wind immediately biting at my face. The scale of the carnage was breathtaking. A Boeing 747, United Flight 12, the one I'd lost contact with 3 hours ago, was pancaked across runway 10L. It hadn't just crashed, it had disintegrated. The fuselage was snapped in 3 places, the interior glowing with the dying embers of a post-impact fire. Scattered across the concrete were hundreds of white specks. From this distance, they looked like luggage. As my eyes adjusted, I realized they were bodies. Some were still, but others were moving, crawling with agonizing slowness through the debris, drawn toward the remaining sounds of life. The sky was a bruised purple, the smoke from the city settling in a low, suffocating haze. I stayed in the shadows of the terminal eaves, moving toward the vehicle staging area. The ground was slick with a mixture of rain and hydraulic fluid. I passed a luggage cart, its engine still idling, the driver slumped over the wheel. I didn't check on him. I couldn't. I saw a Ford F-150 with the Airport Authority logo on the side, parked near the fuel farm. The keys were usually kept in the visor or the center console. I started a low crouch run across the open expanse of the tarmac. The vulnerability was terrifying. In the tower, I was a god of the sky, watching the world from 300 feet up. Here I was a mouse in a field of hawks. Halfway to the truck, a sound stopped me dead. A low, rhythmic thumping. I looked up. A police helicopter was hovering a mile out, its searchlight sweeping the parking lots like a cyclopean eye. It was looking for survivors, or maybe it was just looking for a place to die. Then the light caught me. I froze, squinting against the glare. The helicopter didn't move. It didn't descend. It just hovered there, a silent witness. Then the engine sputtered. A plume of black smoke erupted from the rotor housing, and the bird began to spin. It was a sickening, graceful pirouette. It hit the roof of the parking garage in a spectacular bloom of orange flame and thunder. The shockwave knocked me to my knees. The silence that followed was even deeper, broken only by the crackle of the new fire. I reached the truck, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the door handle. Locked. I didn't hesitate. I wrapped my jacket around my fist and smashed the driver's side window. The glass shattered into 1,000 diamonds. I reached in, unlocked the door, and scrambled inside. The keys were in the ignition. I twisted them, and the engine roared to life, a beautiful mechanical growl that felt like a defiance against the end of the world. But the noise was a dinner bell. Heads snapped up all across the tarmac. The things near the crashed 747 began to turn. They didn't run, they shambled, a relentless, undulating wave of gray. I slammed the truck into gear and floored it, the tires screaming for traction on the oil-slicked concrete. I didn't go for the main gates. I knew the access roads would be choked with abandoned cars and the things that hunted in them. I aimed for the perimeter fence near the cargo area. As I drove, I saw the true face of the collapse. A group of TSA agents were backed against a fuel tanker, their pistols empty, clicking uselessly as a crowd of passengers they were supposed to protect tore them apart. I saw a pilot, still in his crisp white shirt and gold bars, wandering aimlessly near a nose gear, holding a severed arm like it was a precious heirloom. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The guilt was a heavy weight in my chest. The thousands of people I'd guided into this trap today, the voices on the radio I'd watched disappear into the static. I was the last voice many of them ever heard. The fence loomed ahead, a 10-foot wall of chain link and barbed wire. I didn't slow down. I gripped the steering wheel, tucked my chin into my chest, and braced for impact. The truck hit the fence at 60 miles per hour. The metal screamed, the poles snapping like toothpicks, the chain link wrapping around the hood like a steel web. For a second I thought the truck would stall, but the engine groaned and pushed through, dragging a section of the fence behind me like a bridal train. I was out. I was on the outskirts of the airport, the sprawling suburbs of Rosemont stretching out before me. But there was no relief. The horizon was a solid line of fire. The interstate was a ribbon of red taillights, a graveyard of people who thought they could outrun the inevitable. I drove through the grass, avoiding the roads, the truck bouncing violently over the uneven terrain. I needed fuel, I needed food, and I needed to find out if there was anywhere left that wasn't burning. My mind kept drifting back to the tower. I wondered if the power was completely out now. I wondered if the red light was still pulsing, illuminating the empty chairs and the flickering screens. I thought about the flight strips I'd left on the desk, little pieces of paper representing hundreds of lives, now just litter in a room full of monsters. I reached a small strip mall a few miles from the airport. It was eerily dark, the windows smashed, the parking lot littered with discarded clothing and suitcases. I pulled the truck behind a dumpster and cut the engine. The silence rushed back in, thick and heavy. I sat there in the dark, the heat from the engine ticking as it cooled. My hands were still gripped tight around the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I looked at the flashlight on the passenger seat. It was covered in dark, tacky blood. I realized then that I was still wearing my headset around my neck. I reached up and pulled it off, the plastic snapping in my hands. I threw it out the broken window. I wasn't a controller anymore. There was no more traffic to direct. There was no more sky to watch. There was only the ground, the dark, and the things that lived in it. I stayed in the truck for a long time, watching the glow of Chicago on the horizon. The city looked like a bed of embers. Occasionally, a bright flash would signal an explosion, a gas line, a transformer, or maybe another plane finally succumbing to gravity. The psychological toll began to settle in, a cold numbness that started in my fingertips and moved inward. I thought about my wife, Sarah. She'd been at the downtown office today. I tried calling her 100 times before the cell towers went dark, the calls always ending in that mocking, three-tone all circuits are busy signal. I knew the odds. Downtown Chicago was a death trap of high-rises and narrow canyons. If she was there, she was gone. I had to accept that, or I'd never survive the night. I leaned my head against the headrest and closed my eyes, but the images wouldn't stop. I saw the radar screen, the little green blips winking out one by one. I heard the last transmission from Delta 88. Tower, we have a situation in the cabin. They're breaking through the cockpit door. God, there. And then the static. I opened my eyes, the red pulse of the tower's emergency lights still burned into my retinas. I needed a plan. I couldn't stay in the truck forever. The smell of the smoke was getting stronger, a thick, acrid stench of burning plastic and hair. I reached into the glove box and found a tattered map of Illinois and a half-eaten bag of beef jerky. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I looked at the map, my eyes tracing the lines away from the city toward the rural areas to the west. There was a small private airfield near DeKalb. My brother kept a Cessna there. It was a long shot, a desperate, fatting hope, but it was all I had. I started the truck again, the engine's vibration a small comfort against the encroaching void. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I saw a figure standing under a dead streetlight. It was a child, maybe 7 or 8, wearing a tattered pajama top. For a fleeting second, my heart leaped. A survivor. I slowed down, my hand reaching for the door handle. Then the child turned. The streetlights were out, but the glow from the burning city was enough to see the hollowed-out sockets where eyes should have been, the jaw hanging at an impossible angle. It didn't scream. It just began to trot toward the truck with a terrifying, jerky gait. I floored it, the tires kicking up gravel. I didn't look back. The transition was complete. The man who cared about safety, about regulations, about the lives of thousands was dead. He died in that tower, somewhere between the first bite and the last radio call. The man driving the truck was someone else, someone harder, someone colder. I drove into the night, the flames of Chicago reflecting in the rearview mirror, a funeral pyre for the world I once knew. The road ahead was dark, filled with shadows and the unknown, but I kept my eyes on the horizon. I was a survivor now, and in this new world, that was the only job that mattered. The miles clicked by in a blur of abandoned cars and burning houses. The suburbs were a gauntlet of nightmares. Every few minutes I'd see movement in the peripheral of my headlights, shadows leaping over fences, figures huddled over shapes on the sidewalk. I kept the truck in the middle of the road, weaving through the stalled traffic. The highway was a graveyard of ambition. People had tried to take everything with them, U-Hauls, roof racks piled high with boxes, even boats. Now it was just fuel for the fires. I saw a family huddled on top of an RV, the father swinging a tire iron at the hands reaching up from below. I didn't stop. The logic of the new world was cruel. Every person you tried to save was just another person who could drag you down. I hated myself for it, but the hatred was a dull, distant thing. My stomach growled, a reminder of the jerky in the glove box. I ate it slowly, savoring the salty, leathery taste. It was the best thing I'd ever eaten. It was life. As I neared the edge of the suburban sprawl, the density of the traffic began to thin. The fires were fewer here, replaced by a deep, oppressive darkness. The moon was a sliver of white, offering little light. I turned off my headlights, relying on the ambient glow and my own night vision. I didn't want to be a beacon. I was learning the rules of the hunt. Silence was safety. Darkness was a shield. I passed a sign, DeKalb 30 miles. I gripped the wheel tighter. If I could get to the Cessna, if I could get into the air, I could see. I could find somewhere the fire hadn't reached. I could be a controller again, but this time I'd be controlling my own destiny. The wind howled through the broken window, carrying the scent of the dead and the dying, but I didn't close it. I needed to hear them coming. I needed to be ready. The nightmare was only beginning, but for the first time since the world broke, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't fear. It was purpose. I was going to live, even if I had to burn the whole world down to do it. The road stretched out before me, a black ribbon into the heart of a dying country, and I drove on, a ghost in a machine chasing the dawn. The 30 miles to DeKalb felt like a descent into the ninth circle. The black ribbon of the highway was no longer a road. It was a graveyard of ambition and panicked flight. I kept my speed constant, a steady 40 miles per hour, fast enough to outrun the shambling shadows that lunged from the ditch lines, but slow enough to weave through the skeletal remains of the Exodus. My eyes flicked constantly from the road to the mirrors, scanning for the telltale glimmer of eyes or the unnatural movement of something that didn't care about the cold or the dark. The silence of the cabin was a pressurized suit, holding back the scream of the world outside. I found myself whispering flight coordinates, old headings, and weather patterns under my breath like a rosary. It was the only language I had left that made sense. Every few miles, I'd see a car burned out to a husk, the metal warped by heat, sometimes with a blackened shape still gripped to the steering wheel. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. In the tower, we used to talk about separation minima, the minimum distance required between aircraft to prevent a collision. Now, my separation minimum was as far as I could get from anything with a heartbeat or a hunger. The ambient glow of the horizon, a bruised purple and orange from the distant fires of Chicago, provided just enough contrast to see the silhouette of the DeKalb Taylor Municipal Airport perimeter fence. It rose out of the cornfields like a jagged spine. I killed the engine a mile out, coasting the heavy truck down a slight incline, the tires crunching softly on the gravel shoulder. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. I stepped out, the cold air biting at my skin, the scent of dried corn husks and copper-rich decay filling my lungs. I reached into the truck bed and pulled out the heavy iron pry bar I'd scavenged. It wasn't a pilot's tool, but it was a survivor's key. I moved toward the gate, my boots making no sound on the frost-dusted earth. The airport was a shadow play of hangars and small-engine craft, their wings reflecting the dying light of a world on fire. I expected resistance, guards, looters, the dead, but the silence here was different. It was the silence of an abandoned nest. Then I heard it, a rhythmic, wet thudding. It was coming from the terminal building, a low-slung structure of glass and brick. I froze, pressing my back against the corrugated metal of a hangar door. The sound was followed by a low, guttural moan that didn't sound human, but didn't sound entirely animal either. It was the sound of something trying to remember how to speak. I shifted my grip on the pry bar, my knuckles white. "Don't move," a voice hissed from the shadows. The barrel of a shotgun pressed into the hollow of my neck before I could even blink. I went rigid, the controller brain kicking in, calculating variables, assessing threats. I didn't turn around. I didn't breathe. "Squawk 7500, I whispered, the universal transponder code for a hijacking. Unlawful interference. The pressure of the barrel lessened slightly but didn't vanish. "What?" the voice asked, shaky and thin. "It's a code," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "I'm a controller, from O'Hare. I'm just looking for a way up." The shadow stepped around me. It was a man, mid-40s, wearing a grease-stained flight jacket and a look of such profound exhaustion that I thought he might just collapse. This was Miller. I recognized him from the ID badge hanging crookedly from his neck, an airport manager. For a moment there was a spark of recognition, a shared understanding between two men who had spent their lives in the service of the sky. He lowered the shotgun, his hands trembling. "O'Hare," he breathed, a ghost of a laugh escaping him. "God, is there anything left of it?" "Just smoke and ghosts," I replied. "I'm looking for the Cessna, 172, tail number November 4602 Sierra. Is it still here?" Miller's face twisted into something ugly, a mask of grief and desperation. "She's fueled. I was waiting for my daughter. She was supposed to come from the city. She never made it." He looked toward the terminal, toward that wet thudding sound. "They're in there. They're all over the runway. We can't get to the hangars without waking them up." "We go together," I said, sensing the shift in the air. "I can navigate, I can handle the radio if there's anyone left to listen. You know the ground. We get to the plane, we clear the deck, and we're gone." Miller looked at me, and for a second I saw hope. It was a beautiful, dangerous thing. We moved through the shadows of the parked planes, a pair of wraiths navigating a graveyard of aviation. The Cessna was in Hangar 4, near the end of the line. The apron was littered with luggage, abandoned shoes, and things that had once been people, now reduced to heaps of tattered clothing. We were 50 yards from the hangar when the betrayal happened. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was the simple, primal urge of a man who had lost everything and decided he wouldn't lose his last chance at life. Miller tripped, or pretended to. He went down hard, and the shotgun went off with a deafening roar that shattered the silence of the Illinois plains. The buckshot whistled past my ear, thudding into the side of a parked Piper Cherokee. The silence didn't just break, it evaporated. From the terminal, from the ditches, from beneath the shadows of the wings, they emerged. A sea of them moving with a jerky, unnatural speed drawn by the dinner bell of the gunshot. Miller didn't get up. He rolled, kicking my legs out from under me. As I hit the pavement, the air rushing out of my lungs, he scrambled toward the hangar door. He hadn't tripped. He had used the shot to call them, to create a diversion. He was going to use me as the meat to clog the gears while he made his escape. "Sorry, kid," he spat, his face illuminated by the distant fires. "Weight limits, only room for one." He ducked under the half-raised hangar door and slammed the manual release. The heavy steel door began to grind downward. I scrambled to my feet, the first of the dead only yards away. It was a woman in a floral dress, her jaw hanging by a single tendon, her eyes milky and fixed. I swung the pry bar with a primal scream, the iron catching her in the temple with a sickening crunch. She went down, but 3 more were behind her. I didn't look back. I dived for the narrowing gap of the hangar door. I rolled under the steel edge just as it hit the concrete with a thud that vibrated in my teeth. Inside, the hangar was dim, smelling of oil and old dreams. Miller was already in the cockpit of the Cessna, his hands fumbling with the ignition. The engine coughed, a pathetic metallic hack that didn't catch. He was screaming at the dashboard, pounding the instruments. I stood up, blood from the woman on the apron dripping from my sleeve. I didn't feel fear anymore. I felt a cold, crystalline rage. I had spent my life guiding people to safety, calculating every foot of altitude to ensure they got home. And this man had tried to feed me to the dark. I reached the cockpit door just as the engine finally roared to life, the propeller becoming a blur of lethal motion. Miller looked at me, his eyes wide with terror, and reached for the shotgun he'd leaned against the co-pilot's seat. I didn't give him the chance. I grabbed the door handle and wrenched it open. The roar of the engine was deafening in the enclosed space. I hauled him out by his collar, the strength of the adrenaline making him feel as light as a child. He fell to the hangar floor, the shotgun sliding away under the fuselage. "I need a pilot," I snarled over the engine's whine, "but I don't need a snake." The hangar doors began to shudder. The dead were throwing themselves against the metal, 100 hands drumming a frantic, mindless beat. The steel was strong, but the hinges were screaming. I climbed into the pilot's seat, my hands finding the familiar shape of the yoke. I hadn't flown in 5 years, but the cockpit was my church. I knew every dial, every switch. Mixture rich, carb heat cold, flaps up. I looked at Miller, who was backing away toward the rear of the hangar, realization dawning on him that he was trapped in here with me, and the things outside. "Wait," he screamed. "I have the keys to the fuel farm, you'll run out." "I'll glide before I fly with you," I said. I throttled up. The Cessna strained against the chocks. I kicked the manual release for the hangar's rear exit, a smaller motorized door meant for personnel. It slid open, revealing the taxiway and the open sky. I didn't look at Miller again. I didn't look at the fingers that were already starting to pry under the main hangar door. I released the brakes. The plane lurched forward, the propeller biting into the air. I taxied out with a reckless speed, the wings clipping a stack of oil drums, sending them spinning. As I turned onto the taxiway, I saw them. The runway wasn't clear. It was a gauntlet. Hundreds of them had swarmed from the terminal, a carpet of gray and rotting flesh covering the white stripes of the asphalt. I slammed the throttle to the wall. The engine screamed in protest, the airframe vibrating as if it were about to shake itself to pieces. I was an ATC. I knew the takeoff roll for a 172 was about 800 feet on a good day. With the wind at my back and the weight of the fuel, I needed every inch. The first impact was soft, a dull thud against the nose gear, then another. The plane bounced as the wheels rolled over the bodies of the dead. Blood sprayed across the windshield, a dark, viscous curtain that wiped out my vision. I didn't blink, I didn't veer. I stared at the airspeed indicator, 40 knots, 50. The plane was fishtailing, the tires losing traction on the slick remains of the undead. I felt the tail lift. 60 knots. Rotate. I pulled back on the yoke. For a heartbeat, the Cessna refused to leave the earth, tethered by the sheer volume of the dead clinging to the struts or caught in the landing gear. Then, with a groan of metal and a sudden, violent release, we broke free. The nose pointed toward the stars. I felt the transition from the jarring, violent vibration of the ground to the smooth, terrifying grace of flight. I was airborne. I reached out and flicked the windshield wipers. They smeared the blood into a translucent pink haze, revealing the world below. DeKalb was a map of fire. I could see the airport, the hangar where I'd left Miller, and the sea of shadows closing in on it. I could see the highway I'd driven, a line of stalled lights stretching back toward the inferno of the city. I leveled off at 2,000 feet, the air up here clean and cold, devoid of the scent of rot. I reached for the headset, sliding it over my ears. The static was a comfort, a white noise that drowned out the echoes of the screams I'd left behind. I tuned the radio to the emergency frequency, 121.5. Guard. Any station, I said, my voice cracking. This is November 460 to Sierra, departed DeKalb. Level at 2,000, looking for a vector. Is there anyone left in the sky? Silence. Only the hiss of the atmosphere. I looked out the side window. To the east, Chicago was a pillar of fire that reached the clouds, a funeral pyre for 3 million souls. To the west, the dark was absolute, an ocean of shadow where the lights of the small towns had been winked out one by one. I was alone in the cockpit, a tiny speck of metal and hope held aloft by the laws of physics that didn't care about the end of the world. Then a crackle, a voice, faint and distorted by distance and interference. 460 to Sierra, this is Scott Air Force Base. Stay clear of restricted airspace. We are holding, repeat, we are still holding. The voice cut out, swallowed by a surge of static, but it was enough. Someone was still there. Somewhere to the south, the embers of the old world were still glowing. I adjusted my trim, feeling the plane settle into the groove. I looked at the fuel gauge, half a tank, not enough to get across the country, but enough to find a new heading. My hands were steady now. The betrayal of Miller, the horror of the runway, the blood on the glass, it was all below the line. I was a controller. I had a flight plan. I leaned the mixture, watching the EGT gauge, optimizing the engine for the long haul. The wind whistled through the door seal, a cold reminder of how thin the margin was between life and the long drop. I didn't care. I was flying. I looked down at the dark earth, at the dying country that had once been home, and I felt a strange, cold peace. The rules had changed, but the sky was the same. It was indifferent. It was vast. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just directing the traffic. I was the one deciding where the journey ended. I pushed the yoke forward slightly, picking up speed, and turned the nose toward the south, chasing the ghost of a signal through the black heart of the night. I was a ghost in a machine, and I was finally home. The horizon began to bleed a pale, sickly gray. The dawn was coming, but it wouldn't bring the light we wanted. It would only show us the true scale of the ruin. I gripped the yoke tighter, my eyes fixed on the distant, flickering stars. I would fly until the fuel ran dry, and then I would glide, and when the air could no longer hold me, I would meet the earth on my own terms. But not today. Today I was the master of the air, and the dead couldn't reach me here. I climbed another 1,000 feet, disappearing into the belly of a passing cloud, leaving the burning world behind. As the white mist enveloped the wings, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding since the towers fell. I was clear for takeoff. I was on my own frequency. I was alive. The white veil of the cloud was a sanctuary, a formless purgatory where the horrors of the earth were erased by a thick, suffocating mist. Inside the cockpit, the world was reduced to the soft, rhythmic hum of the engine and the amber glow of the instrument panel. I was no longer a man fleeing a massacre. I was a component of the machine, an extension of the hydraulics and the lead-weighted gauges. For a long time, there was nothing but the climb. I watched the altimeter needle sweep upward, passing 10,000, 12,000, 15,000 feet. The air grew thin, and the heater struggled against the creeping frost blooming at the edges of the windscreen, but I didn't care. Up here, the physics of the old world still applied. Gravity was the only law, and as long as I maintained my airspeed, I was its master. I felt a strange, detached peace, the kind I used to feel in the tower during the graveyard shift, watching the blips of red and green move across the dark glass of the radar scope. Back then, I was the unseen hand, the voice in the ear of the pilots, guiding them through the soup, keeping the metal from rending metal. Now there was no one left to guide. There were no more squawk codes, no more flight levels, no more handoffs to center. The frequency was a graveyard of static, a hissing void that swallowed the memory of human speech. I leveled off at 17,000 feet, breaking through the tops of the clouds into a world of celestial violet and deep, bruised indigo. The sun hadn't quite cleared the horizon, but its light was bleeding upward, catching the tops of the cloud bank and turning them into a rolling sea of molten gold and silver. It was beautiful, a beauty so sharp it felt like a serrated blade across the throat. Below that golden sea, the world was dying in the dark. I knew what lay beneath the mist, the clogged interstates, the cities turned into funeral pyres, the millions of shuffling, hungry shadows that had once been people I'd navigated home. I looked down at the fuel flow indicator. The numbers were steady, but the math was inescapable. I had a few hours, maybe 4 if I leaned the mixture out until the engine began to stumble. 4 hours of life. 4 hours of being the last controller in an uncontrolled world. I reached out and touched the radio dial, my fingers tracing the cold plastic. The signal I had been chasing, the ghost of a transmission I'd caught while banking over the burning ruins of the suburbs, was still there, buried under a layer of atmospheric interference. It wasn't a voice. It was a pulse. A rhythmic digital click hiss that repeated every 3 seconds. It was coming from the south-southeast, somewhere near the coast or perhaps beyond it. It was a beacon. A cry for help, or perhaps just a machine that didn't know the world had ended, still faithfully broadcasting its location to a sky that no longer listened. I adjusted my heading, bringing the nose around to 165 degrees. The magnetic compass swung sluggishly, settling into the new direction. I felt the yoke vibrate in my hands, a nervous, living thing. I began to talk to the empty cockpit, my voice raspy and strange in the small space. I started giving myself clearances. Ghost 1 Alpha, cleared for the South Coast transition. Maintain 17,000, report the shore. It was a ritual, a way to keep the madness at the door. I imagined the controllers I'd worked with, the men and women who had stood beside me as the screens went dark and the screams started coming through the headsets. I saw their faces in the reflections of the glass. Sully, who had stayed at his post until the glass broke. Sarah, who had walked out into the parking lot with a flare gun and a look of absolute resignation. I was flying for them now. I was the last flight plan in the system, and I refused to be canceled. The sun finally crested the edge of the world, a blinding, indifferent eye that turned the cockpit into an oven. The clouds below began to break, revealing the Georgia coastline. It looked like a map that had been left out in the rain and then set on fire. The green of the marshes was scarred by black streaks of smoke, and the rivers looked like veins filled with ink. I saw the bridges, choked with rusted metal and the tiny, unmoving specks of abandoned cars. From this height you couldn't see the blood and you couldn't see the teeth. You only saw the stillness. It was a planet of statues. I throttled back slightly, beginning a long, shallow descent. The air grew thicker, more turbulent as I dropped toward the heat rising from the ravaged earth. The signal was getting stronger now. The click hiss was sharper, more insistent. I switched the audio to the overhead speakers, filling the cabin with the sound of the ghost's heartbeat. It was coming from the direction of an island, a tiny speck of green and white sand surrounded by the churning Atlantic. I watched the fuel gauge with a clinical, detached focus. The left tank was dry, the right was hovering just above the red line. I was gliding more than flying now, trading altitude for distance, a giant silver bird looking for a place to die. As I dropped through 5,000 feet, the island came into sharp relief. It wasn't just a signal. There were markings on the ground, huge white letters painted on a stretch of flat coastal highway that had been cleared of debris. Land here. Simple. Direct. A command from the living to the dying. I saw shapes moving near the end of the improvised runway, not the jerky, mindless stumble of the dead, but the purposeful, coordinated movement of people. They were waving flags. They were setting off green smoke. A lump formed in my throat, a hard, cold knot of hope that I tried to swallow down. Hope was a dangerous thing at this altitude. Hope made you bank too hard. Hope made you forget your stall speeds. I entered the downwind leg of the approach, my eyes scanning the improvised strip. It was narrow, flanked by salt marshes and the skeletal remains of a beachfront resort. The wind was coming off the ocean, a crosswind that tugged at my wings, trying to push me toward the surf. I fought it, my feet dancing on the rudder pedals, my hands firm on the yoke. Ghost 1 Alpha on final, I whispered, the words of benediction. I lowered the flaps, feeling the plane balloon upward as the lift increased, then settle into a steep nose-down attitude. The engine coughed. A shudder ran through the airframe as the last drops of fuel were sucked through the lines. Then silence. The propeller slowed, the blades becoming a shimmering, transparent ghost before stopping altogether, pinned against the sky. I was a glider now. I had one shot. The world went very quiet. The only sound the whistle of the wind through the struts and the frantic pounding of my own heart. The ground rushed up to meet me, the white sand and the green smoke blurring into a single kinetic smear. I flared the nose at the last possible second, feeling the wheels reach out for the asphalt. The impact was violent, a jarring, bone-shaking thud that rattled my teeth and sent a spray of sparks flying past the window. The plane bounced once, twice, and then stayed down, the tires screaming as I stood on the brakes. The end of the highway was approaching fast, a barrier of sand dunes and twisted driftwood. I steered the plane into a controlled ground loop, swinging the tail around until we skidded to a halt, tilted at a precarious angle, one wing digging into the soft earth. I sat there for a long time, my hands still gripped white-knuckle tight around the yoke. The silence was absolute, a heavy physical weight. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited for the sound of glass breaking, for the scratching of fingernails against the fuselage, for the moans of the hungry. But all I heard was the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant, rhythmic crash of the Atlantic waves against the shore. Then a new sound, a knock. Not the frantic, mindless pounding of a monster, but a sharp, rhythmic rap on the plexiglass. I turned my head, my neck stiff and cracking. A man was standing on the wing. He was wearing an old flight suit, faded and grease-stained, and a pair of aviator sunglasses that reflected the morning sun. He wasn't rotting. He wasn't screaming. He looked tired. He looked like he'd been waiting a long time for a flight that was overdue. He gestured for me to open the latch. My fingers felt like lead as I fumbled with the handle, the mechanism groaning as the seal broke. The air that rushed in was salty and warm, smelling of pine and sea spray and something wonderfully, miraculously clean. It wasn't the smell of the end of the world. It was the smell of the beginning of something else. I climbed out of the seat, my legs shaking so badly I almost fell into the man's arms. He caught me, his grip firm and human, and helped me down onto the wing and then to the ground. Around us, others were emerging from the shadows of the dunes, men, women, a few children, all of them carrying the same look of haunted, fragile endurance. They weren't a colony, they were a crew. "You're the one," the man said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air. "The one who's been squawking 7700 since midnight. We heard you over the emergency frequency, but our transmitter is out. We could only pulse the beacon. We didn't think anyone was left in the air." I looked back at my plane, the silver skin scarred and dusty, its propeller frozen like a cross against the blue. It looked small and fragile against the vastness of the ocean. "I was an air traffic controller," I said, the words feeling heavy and significant, like a title I was reclaiming. I had to see the flight through to the end of the strip." The man nodded, a slow, solemn movement. He looked toward the horizon where the sun was now fully risen, casting long, golden shadows across the sand. "We used to be a coastal surveillance unit," he said, gesturing toward a series of low-slung, camouflaged buildings tucked behind the dunes. "We've got a garden. We've got a well. And we've got a radar that still sweeps the sky every 10 minutes looking for ghosts. You're the first one to actually land." "What?" He led me toward the buildings, and the small crowd parted for us, their faces filled with a quiet, reverent awe. I felt like a traveler returning from a distant, impossible moon. As we walked, I looked up at the sky. It was vast and empty, a perfect, crystalline blue that showed no sign of the fires or the falling towers. It was a blank slate. I realized then that the journey hadn't ended when the wheels touched the ground. It had only changed mediums. I had spent my life managing the movement of others, keeping them separated, keeping them safe, watching the world from a high glass cage. Now the cage was gone. The radar was manual. The separation was no longer measured in thousands of feet, but in the distance between a closed gate and the things that waited outside. We reached the entrance to the bunker, a heavy steel door that looked like it could withstand a hurricane or a siege. The man stopped and turned to me, extending a hand. "I'm Miller," he said. "Welcome to the ground controller." I took his hand. His palm was calloused and warm. It was the first time I'd touched another living person in what felt like 100 years. The weight of the last few days, the exhaustion, the grief, the sheer, crushing terror of the flight, it all came rushing at me at once, a tidal wave that threatened to pull me under. I leaned against the cold concrete of the bunker wall, my eyes stinging. "Is there anyone else?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Did you hear any other signals?" Miller's expression softened, a shadow of grief crossing his face. "A few in the beginning, some military, some private, but they went quiet one by one. The sky is pretty lonely these days." He paused, looking back at my plane. "But you're here, and as long as someone's landing, the world isn't quite finished yet." He stepped inside, and I followed him into the cool, dim interior. The air inside smelled of old paper and coffee, a ghost of a smell from a world that had vanished overnight. He led me to a small room filled with humming equipment and flickering green monitors. In the center of the room was a desk, and on that desk was a headset, its cord coiled like a sleeping snake. "Our radio guy passed away last week," Miller said softly. "He was the one who set up the beacon. He said that as long as the pulse was going, someone might find us. He didn't want us to be alone when the lights finally went out." I walked over to the desk and ran my hand over the equipment. It was old, older than the gear I'd used in the tower, but it was solid. It was functional. I picked up the headset. It felt familiar in my hands, a piece of my own soul that I had thought was lost forever. I sat down in the chair, the springs creaking under my weight. I looked at the monitors, at the sweeping green line of the radar, searching the empty sky for a flicker, a dot, a sign of life. I put the headset on. The static was a low, comforting hum against my ears. I reached out and adjusted the frequency, tuning out the noise until the channel was clear. I wasn't just a pilot anymore. I wasn't a survivor fleeing the dark. I was back on the frequency. I was the voice in the void. I pressed the transmit button, the click echoing in the small room. "This is St. Jude's approach," I said, my voice steady, professional, and filled with a sudden, fierce strength. "To any aircraft in the blind, this is a surviving station. We are located at the following coordinates. The field is clear. The wind is light. We have a landing light waiting for you." I waited, listening to the silence. It was a long, deep silence, the silence of a world catching its breath. But I didn't let go of the button. I didn't stop watching the scope. I was an air traffic controller. My shift wasn't over. I would sit here in the dark and I would watch the green line sweep round, and I would call out into the emptiness until the last battery died and the last sun set. Because somewhere out there, among the stars and the smoke, there might be another ghost in a machine, another soul lost in the clouds, looking for a way home, and I would be the one to bring them in. I looked out the small, reinforced window at the beach, where the survivors were working together to move my plane, tucking it under the cover of the trees where it wouldn't be seen from the air. The sun was high now, the day beginning in earnest. The world was ruined, yes. The dead were legion, and the future was a narrow, dangerous path through the weeds. But for the first time since the towers fell, I wasn't afraid. I had a frequency. I had a purpose. I had a home. I leaned back in the chair, my eyes fixed on the radar, waiting for the first blip of a miracle. I was the master of the air, and now I was the guardian of the shore. The watch had begun, and I was wide awake.